Hi. Well, thank you for listening to Critical Thinking is Required. This is going to be our 16th interview, and it's with Ben Stone, and this is our first video recording, so this should be really interesting. As you can see, I wore a collared shirt so I can try to look fancy. I figured I'd play my part. And today we're going to talk about the non-aggression principle, hopefully, and we'll see if we can stay on topic or learn more about it, because I know we have a few listeners who have some questions, as far as myself included, because it's something I've just recently learned about. And just to let you know, because we haven't really talked, I kind of became a libertarian maybe about 2 or 3 years ago, and I've just started learning about anarchism or voluntarism and all that stuff just probably within the past few months. And I've literally changed from being a minarchist to almost like a nothingist, if there's such a thing. I mean, I don't really know the terms. I'm still learning the terms, but it's when I learned about Jeffrey Tucker and then School Sucks podcast, and then I learned about you, and then James Corbett, and all this stuff. That's kind of where I've learned more about this stuff. But I apologize for taking. But I'm going to be talking to Ben Stone, and I know you're like the host, or you've actually created Bad Quaker Dot Com, right?
Yeah, some people created it for me, and then I began posting. It was like a blog. I was just posting writing, and it was suggested to me that, well, why don't you do audio? And so at first it was myself and my daughter Kai, and we were just doing a conversational type podcast between the two of us talking. And it kept growing. It started out like 20 minutes and then kept growing to an hour, and then eventually she had other projects, so it ended up with me just doing 1 hour podcasts. Everything from it's a really wide scope, from everything from, say, the basics of libertarian view, the basics of anarchism, the basics of anarcho-capitalism, basic of how we view the oppression of the state, and how the difference. I have I had a trouble explaining something that I saw, so I took two very common words that are often interchangeable, which is the state and the government, and I differentiated between the two, making in conversational, the state to me is a lot more like the concept of the legitimacy of government, and government is the actual people and uniforms and machines that they have, and statues that they build, and all that is more like government. So I did some discussions on the separation of the difference between the actual government, being the people and the physical things, and the state, which is the concept that makes people believe that that's all legitimate. So I did quite a bit on that, and I did a series on where the true historical, not the textbook history, but the actual history of the origin of police as we know them today. And also, I've done a lot of what I might call history debunking, where I've taken some great men from history, like George Washington or whoever, and gone back and taken some of their private letters that are available for anybody to read, and shown what kind of people they really were. And some were pretty good guys, Some were a little confused, and some were just really bad people that did a lot of harm, and were not the image that we're supposed to believe of this really good, honest guy chopping down a cherry tree and admitting to it and all that kind of thing. So some of my stuff is debunking history, going into some of the myths of how American wars were started. I did a whole series on war and how each war. Murray Rothbard is one of my great inspirations, and Murray Rothbard once said that there's only been one American war that was justified, and that was the War of Independence. And I almost agree with Murray. Every American war has been a war of American-initiated aggression, including the War of Independence. I believe the War of Independence was also initiated by American aggression, and it could have been a better end could have been accomplished without initiating aggression. It could have been done through not necessarily nonviolent means, but through non-aggressive means. But anyway, so I've gone through. I did a whole series on war like that, and then I have recently I did a series. Well, not recently. I finished about a year ago, which I haven't had a lot of podcasts in this year, so that was some of the more recent of my podcast. But I did a series on going beyond civil disobedience, where I really went in and dissected what civil disobedience really is, what the goal of civil disobedience is, and what to do once you get to a point of where civil disobedience no longer does what you think it's going to do, and you need to take the next step. Well, what step is that, and how do we accomplish it? What's the smart way? What's the wise way? And what's the proven way of going beyond civil disobedience and not resulting in a revolution? I've tried to focus quite a bit on the fact that a revolution is a false hope. It's a thing that actually never accomplishes what the people doing the revolution think is going to happen, and you always end up with as bad or worse of a government once the revolution's over. So it never accomplishes what you think it's going to do. Exactly, yeah. And yeah, exactly. But also a political revolution. So, like in the Philippines in the 1990s, I believe it was, or perhaps the late 80s, there was literally a revolution,
so
but it was a bloodless or almost bloodless revolution, where the whole government was physically thrown out, but without a lot of murder, like usually goes on, and a new government was brought in and set up. And so it was a successful, almost nonviolent revolution, but the result is still an oppressive government. So you didn't really do anything. You just changed one master for another. So I tried to go into that in some of my podcasts. I think we're like 360, 370,
I'm definitely gonna have to check that out, because I just listened to you on Stitcher and I can only listen to like the past 10 or 20 episodes you have. So I'm definitely gonna have to watch. What's it, like 200 episodes? I think you have, right? Jeez, that'll keep me busy then. So okay, so that's gonna be interesting talking about the independence revolution. Just in defining initiation, I think we'll have to probably.
That's
turn
a really
back to
good,
that, because I think
really
it'll be
good
important.
definition. I always
But
like
how
to
would
point
you define?
out
I mean, on our website, I defined the non-aggression
very
principle
things.
based on what I found on Mises.org, which is the initiation of physical force against another is illegitimate.
Deadly.
And I'm just wondering, how would you
aggression.
define the non-aggression principle?
It is a voluntary activity that two people or more engage in, and it can be horribly violent, but it's not aggression. It's not at all aggression. Self-defense, of course, is not aggression. Aggression, as we view it in the non-aggression principle, or the zero aggression principle, aggression is actively seeking that. It's the initiation. The word initiation is the real key that separates it from just violence. Violence in and of itself. You can have a consensual, violent physical relationship that is maybe, some people might see it as weird or kinky or whatever, but it's not aggression. It's not. It could even result in extreme harm to one or both of the individuals engaged, and it's still not aggression. It's voluntary activity. So, in a sense, from a natural law point of view, no law has been broken as long as the initiation of that violence is entirely voluntary. The difference is how, to me, and someone may have a different view on this, but the difference to me is how Google reacts to the two different words. Zero aggression tends to.
So real quick, is there a difference between a zero aggression principle and non,
my site,
or the same thing? I guess non is zero,
more
but
towards other sides. So.
Okay.
It can be argued that the initiation was on the part of the British in the sense that they were occupying people's homes, they were occupying the land, they were forcing taxation.
Okay, I see that.
Were,
okay, so let's talk about initiation.
They were
talking about that, and I'm wondering. So the American Revolution, you said that it was actually the founding fathers that sort of initiated.
Individual
sort of
governors,
violence?
individual soldiers, individual tax collectors were initiating aggression on individual colonists. But when you start bringing in collectivist ideas and you start saying, okay, so all of us colonists have to get together and fight a war to kick out the British, then you're bringing in central planning, you're bringing in collectivist ideas, and you're forcing people to be involved who don't necessarily want to be involved one way or the other. So, for instance, with Quakers, as a prime example of that, there were Quakers who viewed the English rule as aggression, but they also viewed the colonial rule as aggression, because whoever is in who assumes authority and assumes titles of authority and wants to force me to pay for their lifestyle and force me to pay for their fighting and their war and force me to pay their soldiers and pay to buy uniforms for them. It doesn't really matter if those aggressors are in Philadelphia, in the case of in that historical setting, or if they're in London. We still have people who are willing to point their gun at me and make me pay for them to have their little war. So, and that was the Quaker view at the time. And there were actually Quakers that had all of their property taken. They were beaten. Some were hung and even burned at the stake during the American Revolution by the colonists. Not because they were British. They were not British supporters at all, but because they refused to pay to support the war. Not all Quakers are complete pacifists. So even Quakers that are not complete pacifists, they didn't want to support the war because they knew that the war was immoral at its base.
A negative unintended consequence of the non-aggression principle?
But going
like
to your
Quakers were actually, their land was taken, some died, some were injured,
the non-aggression
never acted in self-defense.
Is to blame for aggression because someone didn't fight. Is like walking up to a person and punching them in the nose and blaming them for the blood because they didn't defend themselves properly. The blame always has to go on the aggressor, not on the peaceful person. So it's never the fault of peace when aggression takes place. Is that right? Keep in mind that there are.
But
still
when would that
Quakers
end? Because, like, my thinking, let's say we did have a volunteer society.
Throughout history, there have been cases.
And if it was just, I guess it's. I see. I'm still trying to understand this. I guess it would be
generally
ruled
in a
by
tribal setting,
that non-aggression principle.
But
that's still on an individual basis, and that's not guaranteed that everyone's going to follow that. So there's still going to be aggressors,
eventually,
right? So you could still theoretically be taken over, just like the 21st century, the Quakers were in that instance.
As supporters of the state, as government people have moved into their territories, the typical response is the people who are following the non-aggression principle must either adopt their belief in the state and begin functioning with the government, or typically they're exterminated. So yeah, in a sense, you could make the argument historically that that the result of adhering to the non-aggression principle is eventually you'll be exterminated. On the other hand, yeah, and it's happening right now in Brazil and Central America. I mean, in South America, and it has happened within the last 20 to 25 years in areas in Africa and throughout Southeast Asia. Right. There's a large area of upland Southeast Asia that's referred to as Zomia that has never had a successful government. On maps, it's always drawn in as this belongs to China, this belongs
Native
to
Americans
Cambodia, this belongs to India,
example.
this belongs. But in reality, those nation states have never occupied the highlands of Southeast Asia. That has always been theoretical on a map. when you get your feet on the ground in those areas, they're all still tribal, and those people are all still stateless. Now, as technology changes and as the governments of the world utilize that technology, more and more people that are in, like in that case in Zomia, more and more of those people are given the opportunity to either assimilate into the government and the state and that society, or be exterminated. So that's a continuing. That's probably the best argument against the non-aggression principle. However, there's another aspect of this that I would argue that's a part of human nature, and that is the desire for freedom. Within the human, there is a desire for freedom. And if we think of it in a market setting, let's say there's a desire among, let's say you have a civilization of people or a country, we'll do it geographically. Let's say you have the United States and you have the people of the United States. If there's a population of people spread out in the United States that want to grow and own and consume dandelions, let's say. But there's a prohibition on dandelions. Let's say the government decides to exterminate all dandelions. And so the government goes around and sprays yards, whether you want it or not. They come in, spray your yard, kill your dandelions. And eventually, if you're caught with dandelions, you're prosecuted. And anyone caught buying or selling or growing dandelions will be punished by the government. If you can, create in your mind such a bizarre scenario. As much money and as much effort and as much soldiers and as much policing as the government wants to put into that, market forces are such that the government will not be successful. There will still be dandelions, and there will still be consumers of dandelions, and there will be the price of dandelions will go up to the point of where there will be people growing and providing dandelions who don't care about dandelions. Because when there's a market demand for something, there's always something to fill that market demand. Well, it's my contention that the state of freedom is something that is deep inside every human. And sometimes we can be appeased with, a new Cadillac or a big house, or we can be appeased by different things temporarily, and it can fill that void. But ultimately, the human spirit, I think, cries for freedom constantly. It's kind of like the difference between, if you imagine, if you look genetically at a dog and a wolf, these two creatures are extremely close genetically, but there's a slight difference. And I used to own a dog that was half coyote, and he was a really, really good dog. But deep within him, and he had been raised since he was a puppy. He had a dog mother and a coyote father. So since he was a puppy, he was hand-raised by humans, and he'd been around humans his whole life. And he was a wonderful dog, but deep within him, late at night, when there would be way out in the middle of the Mojave Desert, when there would be chips and howls of the coyotes in the distance, it was alive in him, and he felt it. And you could tell that he had certain aspects of his nature that were just different from your typical dog in a yard. And I believe that's the thing with humans. We've been through a lot to try to domesticate us in the last 5,000, 7,000 years or so. But deep within us is our nature, and our nature is to be free. And that means there's a market for freedom. And it doesn't matter that the governments of the world have decided that they're going to extinguish it, and they're going to limit it, and they're going to try to restrict it, and they're going to make slaves of us all eventually. I mean, that's the actual goal of government, is to have everyone serving the government. But it doesn't matter, because there's a market desire for freedom. And no matter what law is passed, ultimately, humankind will either do one of two things. They will either achieve freedom, or governments will squash that desire, and humanity will cease. But there's no third option that I can see. I think amongst some human beings, the ones that are on top, the aristocrats, the ones who always, throughout time, have profited from the existence of government. Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's an equal desire for state?
There is a market desire for government right now. That's why some people will tell you that that we need to vote out, minimize government by voting it out little by little, or others.
No, but even beyond that, just
people out there who want a violent
it's like a security
government.
blanket.
They've said that very
I mean, I'm
loudly.
sure, like, you know how Republicans will go on
out,
government,
there's a market currently,
military,
there's a
that's their
market
security
desire for
blanket, or
government.
Democrats will look at
but to a large extent,
safety net.
the
That's their
vast majority
security
of that
blanket. Even though it
market
doesn't
desire
work, and
for
even though it
government is
profits, they
based
know
on
it profits.
They don't know that there's any other way.
Corporations and blah blah
They
blah,
equate
but they
government
still
with good
really
roads, or
just
they equate
crave it. Don't you think so?
government with, security from other governments, the military. They equate government with providing food for the poor, or they think that that's the role of government. They don't realize that that's not the role of government, and all of those things that they think that government provides for them, government does it begrudgingly, far less efficiently than the market would under other circumstances. So this is just an education level. It's like I use this comparison all the time. If you had a Wayback Machine, if you had a magic time machine, and if you had a big bucket of iPhones, and if you had a cell tower, or 5 cell towers, let's say, that you could transport through history to, say, 1500 Paris, year 1500 AD Paris. And so you show up and you distribute cell towers all around the Paris area in the year 1500, and you've got this bucket of iPhones. You could not sell one of these things. Nobody would buy one. They would be, even if you had, say, if you took some solar equipment with you so it could all be powered, any scenario you can create where the people of Paris in the year 1500 could have brand new iPhones in every pocket, you couldn't sell one of them, and it's all an education problem. They wouldn't see the need for it. They wouldn't have a desire for it. They wouldn't see the functionality of it. And that's ignorance. It's just ignorance. Freedom's a little different, I believe, because there is that desire in there, but currently it's being pacified. It's being given a false, to be crude, and this is, I want to be careful with the language that I'm using because I'm not sure what audience we're going for, but in the 1800s they didn't have what we now call binkies or pacifiers. They had a thing called a sugar teat, and it was basically it was a cloth that was dipped in water or milk, and then put a little bit of sugar on it or a little bit of honey on it, and you would give that to a child if you were trying to pacify them. If you didn't have a wet nurse or mother to breastfeed them, then you would give them this sugar teat. And it wasn't the real thing. It didn't satisfy their hunger, and it didn't keep them alive nutritionally, but it shut them up and it fooled them into thinking that they were having dinner. And that's kind of what a pacifier does with a baby nowadays, and it also helps with teething, but or it can really mess up their teething. It's according to how it's done, but that's beside the point. But that's kind of what what governments do. Governments provide us a sugar teat so that we think we're getting something, but we're really not. And as more and more people are exposed to the truth, and as they understand this, and it's a sales thing. It's not something we can force on people. It's not something we can drag them to. It's a slow process. Ayn Rand, and I don't agree with a lot of Ayn Rand stuff, but Ayn Rand said way back in the 60s, she said, we're not as far along in this as you think we are. And I think that's really, really important. A lot of people say, we have to have liberty in our lifetime. We have to see this freedom happen now. We're going to elect this great man over here, and he's going to bring this all in, and he's going to end the Fed, and he's going to do all these wonderful things. And I just fall back on that statement. We're not as far along as you think we are. We've still got a long way to go. We've got to sell a product. We've got to sell cell phones to 1500s Paris, and that's our job. And eventually, the desire for freedom will become so overwhelming, and the lack of desire for government will become so weak that one thing will replace the other in the market. And at some point in time, there were still people saying those automobiles, that's a trend, that's just a bunch of crazies, that's not going to go anywhere. Keep your money where it should be here in wooden wheel axles for wagons, because that crazy trend of automobiles is not going to make it. But eventually, the better of the two wins in the marketplace.
So you're very optimistic. I sense. See, my problem with that, being the cynic that I am, is that I can, and you're a man of history, or just common sense, looking at history, and just like you said, thousands of years we've been putting up with this some form of state. Maybe it's bigger now, maybe it's actually less. We can make arguments, but regardless, that form is still there. And like when I think about this education idea and all that stuff, I think of someone like Spooner.
Right.
Like in the 19th century, who was saying the same stuff that we're kind of saying. And I'm sure there were people before him, and I'm sure if I was to learn more about this stuff, I'm sure I could find something.
Well, I kind of fall back.
And I think it's the same thing here, where even something with like the Free State Project, which is great, it's still only a few amount of people relative to the number of people in the country. And I think it's great that we have you and Jeffrey Tucker and all this stuff. Stephen Rowling, all these stuff that we have people, but we're from all over the world, so it kind of makes it.
That are really easy to observe.
It gives a false hope in the sense that maybe he's got 100,000 listeners, but that's throughout the whole world.
Consume
that's still nothing compared to someone like Sean Hannity, who has
it will constantly,
and that's just in the United States. So I'm just wondering, how do you get around that?
Manipulate the lesser aggressive governments until the time comes that there are less governments in general, and the remaining governments are either entirely docile at the foot of the bigger, stronger governments, or they are replaced by the bigger, stronger governments. So the logical end, as looking at it economically, governments, the number of governments must reduce to the point of where there's one all-consuming government, and that's even, there are certain liberals and progressives in history within the last 100 years who have said this openly, that this is the logical end of government. And no, they didn't say the logical end, but this is the path, this is the progression of government, is to eventually have one, because governments, or whatever they want to label it at the time, but governments tend to fight each other, and that's very bloody and horrible and expensive. So if 10 governments have 10 times more of an opportunity to fight each other than, say, one government rarely fights itself. So 10 governments are more likely to fight than 9. 9 governments are more likely to fight than 8. 8 governments are more likely to fight than 7. So the logical direction to take this is to reduce the number of governments. How do you do that? Well, the most efficient way is war, is kill another government and take that, or make a puppet government out of them. So that's the tendency we've seen in the last 100 years in government. It used to be empire building in the sense that the Roman Empire or whoever would just take one nation after the other and just absorb them into its bigger and bigger and bigger structure. But that becomes so cumbersome that it's not manageable. So the more logical way is for a single entity government to branch out and have satellite governments that are under its umbrella, until eventually you have a proxy government that's over all of them. Essentially, you have one government stopping all war, and that's the idea of it. But it's not within the nature of government to not have war. It's been said that war is the health of the state, and the state comes into its fullness when it's in war. And we see this throughout the history of governments. They have always thrived on war, and when they don't have war, their economies are not doing all that well. And some economies say that there's such a thing as a war bubble or a war surge in the economy. Of course, Austrian economists have debunked this and shown that war actually destroys wealth. It doesn't create wealth. It shifts wealth into the pockets of a few warmongers and opportunists. But the overall effect of war is a reduction of wealth. So if we continue this thought through, eventually there will be one master government. It may be in that position by proxy, or it may be in that position through pure dominance. But there will be eventually one government, but it won't be able to stop war. It'll need to feed off of war, and as it does so, it'll destroy more and more wealth. And as this happens, it'll become more and more obvious to more and more people that more government is not the answer, and that centralized planning is not the answer. And as that happens, then I see less and less of a market for government, and more and more of a market for the answer to government. And of course, freedom is the answer to government. I don't know if I answered that or not, but I'm pro self-defense. I think complete pacifism is unnatural. Yeah. Well, the smart aleck answer would be, well, a gun is an inanimate object, like a rock or a stick or
That's good. I know we got a little sidetracked, although I appreciate this
if the
conversation.
Possession of a gun,
but I did want to let's go back to initiation.
Possession of any object.
I remember we were talking about self-defense, and
so
we were talking about Quakers as well. And so,
I can kill
and then
a person
zero aggression.
just as
So
dead with a rock
I don't
as
think
a gun.
you're against using
And
self-defense,
in a natural
right?
setting,
Okay.
no. I would argue.
Okay,
throughout
so
history,
okay,
more people
and
did
so
kill
I'm
by
wondering.
rocks
So
than
let's talk about initiation, I guess, before we even get into that. And as far as just some examples, some real life examples or something. And I'm just wondering, is the possession of a gun, is that enough to establish initiation of force?
Well, the efficiency of the inanimate object can be argued, but during war, whether they're slashing each other apart with broadswords, or whether whether an arrow pierces your heart, or whether a chunk of lead, or whether a
But what you're more likely, let's say it's a little easier, right? Let's just say
not really. It's an inanimate object. It has no will. It has no good. It has no evil. It's
well,
just
I
an
don't know,
inanimate object.
I know there's millions of people who have died, but I don't know how in wars, but I don't know if they're actually killed by guns. I mean, I can look at Normandy or something, and had they had rocks on the beaches of Normandy, I don't know if as many people would have died compared to a machine gun. Okay. Okay, here we go. Not all inanimate objects are necessarily dangerous. So we could have a feather. So if I had a feather and I had a gun, there would be a difference. So it's not like a universal law.
A threat is not an initiation. In addition to that.
Okay, but I'm playing critical thinking here. Like, let's say, because I can see an argument, and I've heard it actually,
or a knife,
on our show.
or
like
you
if,
mentioned.
I was having a dispute with
feather in a vein
about they were mowing on my
give you
lawn,
a nasty
which
infection.
I'd probably be happy with that. But let's say they, I don't know, they did something bad on my lawn,
but
or
the
something.
actual,
and so I came out there and I brandished a gun.
The threat becomes a viable.
Let's say I went out
action
there and
that looks
actually
like,
kind of
like imminent,
picked it out of my pocket or
imminent
wherever,
action
my
is
holster
about
or
to take
whatever, and I
place.
kind of showed it to them while we were talking.
So in other words,
don't
I
you
wouldn't
think
have to
that is
wait
kind of
until,
initiation of force?
let's say the
Because
person
it
aims
makes
a gun
them
at me
fear
and
for their
says,
life
"Well,
or something
that's not
of that
initiation
nature,
because
or
they're
no?"
just pointing an inanimate object." Do I wait until the actual firing pin is struck and the bullet is on its way down? So
Okay, so that's where we're getting at.
without focusing on an
So how would
object
you
that has
define
no will
initiation,
and no
I guess?
intent, and just thinking of the person. Once the person takes action that is intended to do harm, then at that point, any action taken by the other is justified to stop that harm. Does that follow? Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Um, Walter Block has probably done more work in this kind of area than
Yeah,
anyone
I'm
I
with
can
you.
think
Okay,
of.
so
And
let's do another
he goes
example.
through a
So
lot
in
of
India,
different
there was a
scenarios
recent
and plays with these
story
different
where
settings.
I guess
And I
the
have
government
yet to,
here, but so this is a little different, but they closed a
in
Coca-Cola
regards to
bottle
this type
factory
of discussion,
because it
I've
was
yet to
taking
find
too much
anything that I would
groundwater.
disagree with Walter
So I'm
Block
thinking,
on this. So
is
I would
that a type
defer
of
to him
initiation where
on this kind of thing. But
let's say we followed
essentially,
a Rothbard
in a
approach where you
perfect
sort of own the
libertarian
property below
society, in a
you and above
Rothbardian
you.
libertarian
I'm assuming
society,
you kind of
where
follow
a
that.
person actually owns their
Okay.
property,
Now
including what's
there's a
below their property
groundwater,
and
the
what's above the
aquifer is,
property.
below you,
And the
I don't
way
really know how that
both
works
Rothbard and Walter Block point
property-wise,
that out
but
is,
let's say
it's
you own
kind of
some
in
of
a
that. If someone
triangular,
took
because the
all
Earth
that
gets
water from
smaller
you,
as you
let's
get
say,
closer
maybe
to
not
the
all of
center.
it, but they took so
So
much that you
for
had to
every
keep
inch you
drilling
go
lower
downward, you have
in order to
to
get the
come
clean
inward
water.
at the same time.
And I'm wondering, is that
essentially,
initiation?
until you get to a point of nil somewhere in the core of the Earth. But so essentially, what Walter Block has said is that when you own property in a libertarian paradise type of a setting, a utopian type of setting that can't really exist, but for theory alone, you own as deep down as you have homesteaded downward. So, for instance, with the water rights, if you have drilled a well, let's say 100 feet deep, and you're using off of that aquifer 100 feet deep under your property, then you own all of the water within that range, within that 100-foot range. At least the water that's coming into your property. You don't own it after it leaves your property. So if your neighbor then is on their property using water from that aquifer that hasn't reached your property, then he's using his water and you have no control over that. Well, it's not yours because it's not on your property. Um, mhm, right. Now, going back to the actual thing in India, of course, we have the problem we have the multiple problems in the India situation where we have a government which, by its very existence, is breaking the zero aggression principle. So the government itself is an aggressor to begin with, and everything that the government does and every decision it makes is based on aggression. Every action it takes is based on aggression. So there is no moral action the government can take.
Even though it's taking some of yours,
the Coca-Cola Corporation is a corporation that exists through an arrangement with
I guess I'm looking at it like
a
this,
corporation
right?
exists
And yet
through a
two of them,
relationship with the government.
The diagram
And
here. But they're still kind of hooked up, and if this guy is taking a crap load of water, it's kind of like draining your. I mean, I guess it's not yours, but it's
called.
Well, I guess I see what you're saying, because it's
rather than separating between what is a company and what is a corporation, and what are the legal definitions between these things. But essentially, in a libertarian paradise situation, there would be no corporations, because a corporation is a legal entity that's authorized by a government. So there would be no corporations. And so then a company could grow as large as individual ownership would allow it to grow. All things in a libertarian paradise would eventually be owned by someone. or unowned. And if it's unowned, it can be owned. It can be homesteaded. If it's owned, then it's owned by someone, and that individual who owns it is the ultimate responsible person for it. So that alone eliminates the whole Coca-Cola India setting, because there would be no Coca-Cola and there would be no India. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what about a few more examples? So what about the concept of private property just alone? The idea of me owning something and possessing something, isn't that sort of initiation? And I mean, I guess a better example would be with real property or land or something, but I'm just wondering if two people, see a diamond and it's 100 feet away and it's abandoned, or it's lost or something.
And
Let's say nobody owns it at that point.
To a certain extent, it's
and they're going towards it, and one of them grabs it. Is it at just that point that it's that individual's possession and property?
To a certain extent, this
or
is
is there some sort of initiation there where you're saying you can't have it because it's mine?
Land ownership would be.
I'm just wondering. I know it's kind of basic.
Either one of a couple
of property
things,
and
how much
I don't want to get too complicated,
actual
I'm just
property.
I was just thinking just how
your family.
I guess with
alive.
real property it's a little bit easier. But even
another
then
one
you can
would
do
be
with homestead
how far out can projectile
that kind of
weapons
example. So I don't want to get too deep, but
so
you have an issue of
enough,
where it seems
in
like
a hunter-gatherer
it is
society,
just yours,
I know this is not really
and that
your question,
pushing
but
other
I'll
people
get
away,
very
even though they could
in a
theoretically own that object. So maybe that's a bad example. Maybe a better one would be land,
standard
where they could
arrow
own a
of the
piece
day.
of your land.
You could fire a bow and arrow out a certain distance, and if you stood in the center and had an unlimited quantity of arrows, and you just kept turning slightly, shooting arrows, you would essentially draw a circle around you of arrows that you had fired into the ground, out as far as the arrow could reach. And oddly enough, that's about the same amount of land that it takes to support a small family farm if you're just growing and grazing some Stone Age relative grazing animals, and the food that it takes to support your family. And oddly enough also, that's about an acre. And oddly enough also, in a lot of tribal settings, the marking of property was either an arrow stuck into a stake, or an arrow stuck into a tree, or a staff, which was basically an arrow without fletchings and without tip, that would be placed on a place. And this is how they marked their property. And essentially, if you had more property than you could both protect and use on a regular basis to support your family, then you couldn't keep it. Not because there was any rule or law. It's just that the natural setting provided meant that you couldn't protect or use more than about an acre of land. And of course, if you had a larger family and you had 3 sons who were all of adult age and could weld a bow, then you could expand that out to about 4 acres. But you're still about the size of a little over about an acre for every 2.5 people, say. So that gives you 2 adults and a child. So as this expands out, you see kind of a natural pattern in humanity that says the amount of land that a person can both protect, defend, and utilize is about a fair amount of land that a person can own. Now, as far as actual ownership, we have to look at it and ask, is it natural or is it unnatural to own? And of course, very few people would argue, or I should say, very few people could make anything near a logical argument that a human doesn't own themselves. In other words, if I hold up my finger, it's my finger, and it would be very difficult to convince me that that's not my finger. How can it not be mine? It's attached to me. It's a part of me. Well, if I own that, can I also own the ring that's attached to me? Because this is attached to me and this is attached to me. So, and then ownership goes out. If I have that on, can someone just come up and take it from me? Well, nature tells us, you can look at a dog that's laying there eating, chewing on a bone, and the dog entirely believes that bone is its property. You can also see this in natural settings. If you try to take food from a bear, or if you try to take a cub from a mother bear, they see property. They understand. Some of the simplest mammals understand property. So we see examples in nature of how other animals understand how property works. So then it would be logical to assume that humans should understand how property works. Unless there's something interfering with that understanding of property, we should by nature understand how property works. And then you can view little children. And we do a horrible thing with little children. We take little children and we give them a really cool little thing that's called a toy, and then we put them in a room with other little children, and then we want to force them to share that toy with other children. You can watch kids and see that it is directly against their nature to share their toy with other kids. It's theirs. They want to hold it. They want to have it. But if you break that pattern and force them to share with other kids, then the first thing they want to do is go take something from some other kid. It creates a teaching laboratory where we teach children that possession is bad, ownership is bad, but theft is good. And so now we have something from the youngest ages teaching our species directly opposite of what our nature tells us. Even the most basic, even the most some of the simplest animals, mammals we're talking about, not like invertebrates or whatever. Although octopuses fill this category as well, but many animals are advanced enough to have and protect their property, and yet we have this process supported by the state and supported by the culture that's built upon believing that government is good, that teaches us from the youngest ages that property is bad, that property should be taken from others, and that you yourself shouldn't possess property. You should be willing to give it up as soon as somebody else wants it. So I think it's within the human nature to understand how ownership of property works. And when we get confused about the simplest parts of it, it's because we've been taught against our nature from the earliest ages. Did that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is one of the arguments that's there are many variations of it, but this is one of the primary arguments against anarchism or against complete
Yeah, I think I
libertarianism
get
or
it. I guess
whatever.
my one last
terminology
question.
that
I
might
know
be used.
we're wrapping up here.
There's the fear, of
But it's
course,
just I've been thinking about drones, and I've been thinking about
somehow the
how that would
ultra-rich
affect
or a group
homestead
of rich
and
or whatever
ownership
will
of
do something
property.
that's unfair.
If, let's say, you wanted to
And,
claim
if you
30
take it
acres
back
in
to what is
Colorado,
natural law
and you
how
just built
these
some
things work,
drones that, I mean, maybe not now, but maybe
there
50
is a
years from
certain
now, they could have
amount,
little guns
and
on it or something,
we kind
or
of catch some
that
heat
shoots
from this,
maybe it could even be like
especially
a
from some of
pellet,
the more
like something that would
liberal-thinking
get you
people.
off their property.
There is a certain
And I'm thinking,
aspect
couldn't there
of
be
strong
people who are
surviving and the
wealthy
weak dying off
or
in
who
this,
had the means more than
this
someone who
happens with all
doesn't
species.
could go out there and
But,
just claim, like, let's say
again,
we just became
the
anarchists overnight,
distortions that we
and let's say we
see
had that,
in the models that we have
assuming
available
they had
to us
the
now,
ability to
the distortions are so
the
dramatic
couldn't they
because the
own that
government
land,
interferes in so
and
many
then they would
levels.
have that just right, and I couldn't initiate upon them any type of force?
Oops, I almost kicked the table over. Sorry about that. If you think of like all the super rich people in the world, we know we talk a lot about the 1%ers. Well, actually, the vast majority of wealth is not held by the 1%ers. It's held by like, a tiny percent of the 1%ers. The vast amounts of wealth held by, a group of people that could fit in one hotel. It's yeah. hmm That's a good point. How many Bitcoin would they have? Right, right. One of the flaws in the question, though, however you end up forming it, one of the flaws is that there seems to be a misunderstanding that that somehow we need to have equity, that somehow everyone has to be on an equal footing and have a fresh start and have an equal, a level playing field and all these kind of things. But none of those things exist in nature. I look at a field and I see robins competing with cardinals, competing with nature. Really doesn't provide a level playing field, and nature.
Well, that's why I try to make the
rewards,
distinction of asset ownership too,
hard
because
work and
a lot of that
slackers and
0.01%
punishes
are
those who
bankers.
are not
So,
willing
like, if they have,
to
if
pick
their
up the
wealth is
pace.
just
And to
money,
a certain extent,
then
that's
what value
kind
would
of
that
the
have if we became
cold-blooded
anarchists
parts
tomorrow?
that go back
it
to
would
some
be
of
trash.
some people's objections to
Right.
Ayn Rand
Or whatever
and her
crypto or
thoughts
any type of currency.
is that it's so brutal and it sounds so coarse and so rough. But humanity has one other thing, and some other species have it as well. We can observe this in several other species, but humanity has a lot of compassion. Individual humans really have a lot of compassion. Even some of the people that we think are cold-hearted and cruel and these things, even some of the richest people in the world, they pacify their guilt of being so wealthy by doing things to try to justify their wealth through acts of compassion, whether that's charity or whatever. Now, the whole market in charity, again, is distorted because of the way governments do. They steal from one group and give it to another group, and then central planners divide that all up and decide how it's done, and layers of bureaucrats make their living forever off of that process. So again, the governments have distorted charity, but in a pure setting, humans are unbelievably compassionate. If you get out on, say, like the Appalachian Trail, or you get into a camping situation where there's a lot of rustic camping going on, or you get on the side of a mountain like Everest or something like that, where life depends on people caring for one another, and people who, I see it all the time. We live full time in our RV, and I see it a good example all the time. I can pull into an RV park, and there can be $2-3 million motorhomes there, coaches, and there can be people in tents camping. And even though there's this drastic difference in wealth, there's still levels of compassion, and you'll see somebody who's starting to pull out that day, and they've got some leftover wood they don't want to take with them, and they'll walk around the campground and look for somebody to give it to. And you see this within human nature. It's horribly suppressed by government, but it's in there. It's waiting to come out. And humans get a thrill out of giving a gift to another human. It's actually self-satisfying to give a gift to another human. So, yeah, exactly. So that's the compassionate part of humanity that would make up for the inequalities of nature that we'll have to deal with. No, that's about it. We're here at the Porcupine Freedom Festival in northern New Hampshire having a blast, and I do need to get going. I've got a speaking engagement in about an hour. I have a little bit of prep work for it, but I really appreciate you bringing me on your show. Thanks a lot.